On behalf of the family of George Waters, I'd like to welcome everybody here today. My name is Grant Cosby, and I'm married to Isabel, his daughter. We have come together on this day to remember George, to honor his life, and to make our farewells. Now, it's difficult to do justice to a life that was as long and as full as George's, as well as raising a family of 6 with his wife Connie. George led a remarkably active public life. The list of organizations to which George belonged, the community endeavors in which he participated, often together with Connie, is simply too long to enumerate. Now, many of you here today knew George in one or other of those public roles. But my own experience of him was on a more personal level. But as I became more involved with him in his final years, I came to understand and appreciate the qualities that sustained him throughout the many facets of his long and remarkable life. Perhaps the quality that stands out the most was his determination to do as much as he could for as long as he could. Despite his declining strength and encouraged by his youngest daughter, Frances, he continued to get out of the house to shop at Family Foods, to attend Sunday dinners, and to have lunch at Perkins twice a week with either his son Gordon or myself, until he was hospitalized just 8 days before his death. A good example of George's determined spirit occurred one day a few years ago after shopping at Family Foods. By that point, anyone else would have been using a walker or at very least a cane, but he refused to make any such concession. As we left the store on that blustery March day, the wind blew the receipt from the groceries out of the shopping bag and across the parking lot. Although a much younger person than George, I wasn't about to try to run it down. But, to my surprise, he took off, and to my amazement, he managed to track it down. He caught up with it. Now, all of his life, in his wartime role as an RCAF sergeant, in his career as a hospital administrator, and in his long tenure as a school board trustee, he had to keep track of things. And he wasn't about to abandon the habit of a lifetime just because he was 93. 2 days after he entered the hospital, I returned to Family Foods to tell the staff that George would not likely be coming back. The ladies were saddened, of course, and commented on what a nice man he was. So the next time I visited the hospital, I reported to George what they had said. Now, he was very weak, but he managed to smile, and he said, "They must have an overactive imagination." We'll begin our commemoration with a rendition of The White Cliffs to Dover, a song from the wartime years that meant a great deal both to George and to Connie. It will be sung by Linda Fortier, the daughter of George's older sister, Mary.
I just wanted to make a few remarks before my song, if I may. I'm very honored to be asked to sing for Uncle George's service today. My sister Sharon and I learned as very small children to love Uncle George. He and Auntie Connie took our family in during the 1950 flood when we were evacuated from our St. Vital home. Throughout our childhood, our families visited together quite frequently, and I enjoyed quite a few sleepovers with Anne and Isabel. So Sharon and I grew up feeling very close to our Uncle George and Auntie Connie. Uncle George gave the toast to the bride at my wedding 45 years ago, and he also played a role in Sharon's wedding. Sharon and I were very, very pleased to be able to meet with Uncle George at the hospital just a few days before he passed away. And we just really had an excellent visit with us, and we were so pleased that Isabel had called and alerted us to the fact that he was there. My own son and daughter have been big fans of Uncle George's war stories. He had a talent for selecting and relating his stories to suit his audience. As adults, Sharon and I learned to be very proud of Uncle George. His contributions to public life in Winnipeg were, of course, significant. We have often remarked on having encountered people in different walks of life who knew Uncle George either personally or by reputation and held him in great respect for the work that he has done for so many various organizations in the city. We always felt proud to have such a close connection to him. My favorite story in this regard happened a few years ago at George MacDowell School with a child, not with an adult, where I taught for 24 years. I was on lunch duty. The children at George MacDowell School ate lunch in their classrooms, so I was walking through the halls, and I happened to stop. I saw some photographs outside the classroom of Mr. Lund's grade 4 children, and when I looked at the photos, I realized that the children had had a field trip at the Aviation Museum, and didn't I see Uncle George in many of the photos? So one of Mr. Lund's students, happened to be standing at the door of the classroom, and I called him over. And I said, "Do you remember this man from the Aviation Museum?" And, "Oh yes," he replied enthusiastically. "He was our tour guide. He told great stories." And I said, "That man's my uncle." "No kidding," he said, "your uncle?" And I said, "Yes, he is." Well, he went running into the classroom, and I remember his exact words. He called, "Hey, you guys, remember that cool old guy who took us around the Aviation Museum? He was Mrs. Fortier's uncle." Well, the response from the classmates was just really exuberant. They were just all talking about how much they had enjoyed Uncle George and enjoyed their visit to the museum, and I was really glad that I had stopped to look at those pictures on my way down the hall. Because Uncle George and Auntie Connie met in England during the war years, the whole war experience was very important to them both. One of their favorite singers from this era was Vera Lynn, so I've chosen to sing a song that she made popular during the Second World War. There'll be bluebirds over the white cliffs of Dover tomorrow, just you wait and see. There'll be love and laughter and peace ever after tomorrow, when the world is free. The shepherd will tend his sheep, the valley will bloom again, and Jimmy will go to sleep in his own little room again. There'll be bluebirds over the white cliffs of Dover tomorrow, just you wait and see. There'll be love and laughter and peace ever after tomorrow, when the world is free. The shepherd will tend his sheep, the valley will bloom again, and Jimmy will go to sleep in his own little room again. There'll be bluebirds over the white cliffs of Dover tomorrow, just you wait and see. There'll be love and laughter and peace ever after tomorrow, when the world is free.
Thank you, Linda. As you might expect, we have a number of tributes for George here today. Our first tribute will be given by Bruce Alexander, who was chair of the St. James Assiniboine School Board for 20 years. Bruce?
Hello, everyone. A few days ago, Isabel called me with the sad news of George's passing. And for me, it was an end to a friendship that spanned 35 years. And I can see from the numbers of people that are with us in the room today, just the many organizations that George was involved with and the many people that he touched in his life. And I was fortunate to be one of those people. It's really a great honor for me today to have the opportunity to reflect with you on what his friendship meant to me. So this will be a fairly personal remark. George and I first became acquainted as members of a school board review of the St. James Collegiate family of schools. George was in the role of school trustee, and I was in the role of a community volunteer. School reviews are often charged with emotion and differences of opinion, especially when there's school closures being contemplated, to say the very least. George was the ideal school trustee to be involved. He was a great supporter of community involvement in decision-making. Ever the gentleman. If he heard any commentary from our large committee that was wrong or socially biased, he dealt with it firmly and immediately, but with understanding that any question has many sides. I admired his ability and saw him as a model of school trusteeship at its best. A couple of years later, our paths crossed again. We were both volunteers in the interpretive program at what was then known as the Western Canada Aviation Museum. We had a common interest in aviation history and a willingness to do something about it. Throughout the winter of 1985 and 1986, we spent many hours at the museum, often in conversation. George informed me that he was not to be a candidate for the school board in the 1986 civic election. From that point, I received regular encouragement from George to consider putting my name on the ballot. With George's support and encouragement, I became a candidate and began school board service that extended over 24 years. In 7 elections, I was endorsed by George, and I believe his endorsement of me and his confidence in me was very significant in my success, for which I am still grateful. As a school trustee, I often met with George to sound out ideas and to get advice. In essence, what would George do? Our discussions were not limited to local affairs. George asked when I might be serving on the executive of the Manitoba School Boards Association. He wanted to know what my views were on provincial education affairs. And again, with George's encouragement, I took on the roles of director and vice president at the Manitoba School Boards Association. A highlight of my school board service was the decision the school board made to create a separate middle school at St. James Collegiate campus and name it George Waters Middle School. George and Connie, for many years, have been supporters of our schools, and particularly in the special education programs in them. School naming was the best possible recognition of their leadership and commitment, and I was glad to be a part of it. George and I served together on the St. James Scholarship Fund Board of Directors for 30 years. George set an example for all of us on that board with his loyalty and generous support of scholarships in St. James. On his retirement from Deer Lodge Center, he eschewed retirement gifts. Instead, he asked for donations to the scholarship fund. As a result, the Deer Lodge Center Awards were established in our high schools. Following Connie's passing, George established the Constance Waters Awards at our high school graduations. On his retirement from the scholarship board, he was elected as our first honorary life member, recognizing his long service and his contributions both to our scholarship board and to our community. George served well into his 90s and set an example of loyalty, generosity, and community service that will be very hard to equal. George had a profound effect on my life as a friend and mentor. His example of leadership and service was an inspiration to me. He has often been spoken of in our home when education and schools were being discussed. He will be missed, but his memory will live in the lives of those who shared his friendship. George and I shared one additional common background. We had both served in the RCAF Primary Reserve here in Winnipeg. And I think George's nature can be summed up really quite well in the words of Group Captain Douglas Bader, who you may remember was a legless fighter pilot of the Royal Air Force during the Second World War. Douglas Bader's words: "I think that the greatest of all human virtues is loyalty. It embraces the best of the human character: courage, faith, love, and charity." I will remember George as long as I live, as I'm sure most of you will. And again, I want to thank Isabel for inviting me to speak today, because it's really an honor to do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bruce. George received many honors, of course, in recognition of his community service, but perhaps the honor of which he was most proud was the naming of George Waters Middle School, about which you just heard. Today we have Principal Andrew Lee to speak on the school's behalf.
I am very proud to be in my 6th year as principal at George Waters Middle School. I am very honored to be here today, and I thank you for the opportunity. Schools are made up of bricks and mortars, and nowadays lots of computer wires for help to make, and all those things to help our kids learn. But in reality, what makes school are the people within its walls. Mr. George Waters, our school namesake, embodied the importance of a caring and empathetic approach when working with young people. George Waters, the man, always focused on providing opportunities to everyone to give them the best chance to learn and grow. He wanted to help someone else have a better day. George Waters, the school, has always been filled with kind, accepting, caring, and energetic people, just like George Waters, the man. George Waters, the man, represents all the things that schools should be. Schools need to be kind, accepting, and places where people feel at ease. Mr. Waters always had that ability. He made people feel at ease whenever he was around. Today was our Remembrance Day service at George Waters Middle School. This was one of Mr. Waters' most favorite things to attend. Today's service was especially meaningful to me, the students and staff at St. James Collegiate and George Waters Middle School. We got the chance to speak about Mr. Waters and what he meant to our community, school division, our country, and just to remember him. At George Waters Middle School, we asked students to live up to 3 simple things every day. We call these the 3 levels of sharpening, and we are the George Waters Sharks. The first, our grade 6 students, we just asked them to simply to get involved. The second, to our grade 7s, we asked them to stand up for others. And the third, for the grade 8s, is to be a philanthropist. When we talk about being a philanthropist at George Waters, we mean it to simply be and to do just to make someone else's day better. We say this every day at the end of our announcements, and we also have a video of Mr. Waters saying those exact words, which we often show to our kids. When I think of Mr. Waters, he was all of these things and more. He is a perfect role model for all the young people and the staff who attend his school. We all very much look up to him. I'm always curious about what our students think, so I asked a few of our students what they liked best about George Waters Middle School. This is what they said. This was unprompted, and their words exactly. Araya in grade 6, meeting new friends and all the clubs. Amy in grade 7, how nice everyone is. And Isaac in grade 8, and Isaac is an awesome kid, but he's not a kid that fits school. He comes every day, and sometimes it's a bit of a fight for him. This is what he said: teachers try so hard to keep their students doing well. And to me, that's George Waters. For these 3 comments, I can say the legacy he's leaving us is alive and well at his school. We are so lucky to work at a school named after a man like George Waters. We will work hard to keep his memory and what he stood for alive, and continue to teach our students the values that George Waters stood for.
Thank you, Andrew. I will now ask Linda Thorlickson, who is married to George's youngest son, Gordon, to read 3 more tributes relating to his public life.
Good afternoon. Prior to his career as a civil servant, George spent a number of years in the private sector and was delighted to be named an honorary lifetime member of the St. James Assiniboia Chamber of Commerce. Jennifer Bishop, the acting executive director, has sent us this memory of George. "I don't really know where to start," she says. "George was always a treat to be with. One memory in particular always makes me smile. When George was still able to attend our monthly luncheons on a regular basis, everyone wanted to sit with him because he was such an entertaining and interesting lunch companion. After shaking hands with George, the members would all watch to see which table he sat, and there would be a rush to sit at that table." All of the members remember George fondly, in particular because of his pocket props. He seemed to have a newspaper article or story for any possible topic of conversation. I often wondered how many pockets he actually had in that jacket of his. We were sorry when George could no longer attend our meetings because of his health. Members often asked me how he was, and after I sent out the announcement of his passing, many emailed me to say that they would miss him and that he was a true gentleman and scholar. The next submission recognizes George's many years as a volunteer tour guide at the Royal Aviation Museum of Western Canada. This gig was especially dear to his heart as an extension of his experience with the RCAF both during and after the war. Shirley Render, who is very sorry she couldn't be here today and is the museum's executive director, has sent these words. "George Waters had many lives, and I know that others are going to talk on other aspects of his life, so I will touch on his volunteerism at the Royal Western Canada Aviation Museum. The museum was privileged to have him as one of our star long-time volunteers. He was, without a doubt, one of the most cheerful and willing people I have ever met. He was also a walking book of knowledge on many aspects of military and Canadian history. George was one of those individuals who could bring history alive when he told a story. This is only one of the reasons why George was such an excellent tour guide. He could also size up a group and know instantly on what he should focus. Consequently, he could entertain and educate children to seniors. No one was ever bored, as Linda shared with us earlier. We all admired George for his enthusiasm for everything he did, whether it was promoting a book about a friend's wartime experiences, promoting the museum wherever he went, or bringing in special groups to tour the museum. He approached me numerous times to go out and talk to groups that were not able to come to the museum. He had a heart of gold and did not want people to miss out on hearing about Canada's aviation history. George Waters had a love for life. He always attended our annual general meetings and always made a point of talking to everyone there. When he could not attend the last few, he phoned me to say he couldn't come. The last time he phoned me, he told me not to be sad for him, and that was a hard conversation for me. I know that I speak for all at the museum when I say we miss George Waters and his smiling face. The final message sent from one of his associations with whom he was involved is from Kate White, President of the United Nations Association in Canada. George was a champion, supporter, and leader of the Winnipeg branch of the United Nations Association in Canada for many years. It was through our mandate to grow global citizens that his commitment to youth, education, and the values of the UN were expressed. It is poignant to be saying farewell to George on the eve of Remembrance Day. His experience of war informed his passion for peace. George left his home, community, and country better than he found it through his service, and his service inspires us all.
Thanks, Linda.
Well, two of George's children were unable to be with us today, and I will now read messages that they've sent to mark this occasion. The first of these is from Anne, his eldest daughter. In good foresight, my sisters Isabella and Frances advised me to come to Winnipeg last month to see Dad. He was still living at home at 268 Sharp at age 96, and still going out twice a week to his favorite family restaurant with my brother Gordon and my brother-in-law Grant, alternatively. I'm happy to have visited him in time to say goodbye. I'm also very grateful to all of the family members in Winnipeg who helped Dad lead an active life until very shortly before his death. Especially my youngest sister, Frances, spent a large part of her time in the latter years making sure that Dad remained active. Dad was proud to have served in World War II, based in London in Bomber Command, yet he open-heartedly accepted my study in Germany and my marriage to Wolfgang, the son of a man who fought in the German army. My parents gave a warm welcome to Wolfgang's parents when they visited Canada, and likewise, Wolfgang's parents likewise enjoyed their hospitality when Dad and Mom visited them in their village of Weinstein in southern Germany. They thus, in their own way, contributed to post-war conciliation. Dad always showed interest in Wolfgang's and my work in Africa, and indeed it was the United Nations spirit, which we just heard about, which inculcated in us by Dad and Mom, that encouraged me to go into this type of work. Wolfgang and I are in Africa right now, providing support to development activities in northern Kenya, where people live mainly from livestock, and therefore cannot be with you today. Excuse me. It is the day before Remembrance Day, which Dad faithfully celebrated each year. We would have loved to join in honoring the service of Dad and others in the Allied forces during the war, which also liberated Germany. But above all, his decades of community service locally in St. James, Winnipeg, and Manitoba. How the two of them managed to raise 6 children in addition to all that was almost superhuman. And I have a letter here from John, their eldest son, who was also able to get back to Winnipeg a few days before George's death, in time to talk with him and to join his siblings in spending George's last days at the bedside. This is John's letter. In the middle and later part of his life, my father was largely a public man. That was the man most of you knew and are honoring in your presence today. I want to evoke the younger man and father I remember from my own boyhood and youth, from the end of the war to the 1960s. My father was then in his late 20s to his 40s. He was young and vigorous and starting his family and his career. From that time, I remember first driving to Winnipeg Beach in our first car, a black 1939 Nash Coupe, with my mother in the single front seat, and me and my sister Anne ensconced up on the cozy shelf behind the front seat. Barefoot and with his pant legs rolled up, there's a scene for you, wading with me in the clear shallows of Delta Beach. Driving home in our second car, an early 1950s Chevy, after visiting my cousins in St. Vital, with me in the back seat, feeling secure in the city's darkness because he was my father. Seeing my mother and a very young Anne and I off in the middle of the night at the old TCA air terminal for our long flight to London. Working with the other fathers on the street to build the sidewalk on Sharp Boulevard, then the city's last street, beyond which to the west was the oak forest starting at the foot of our backyard. Lacing up my skates for me in the wood stove heated shack at the cold and windy outdoor rink up on Ness Avenue. Taking me with him to work on Saturday mornings in the Mackenzie Food Products office in the National Cartage Building, near where the Red and Cinnabon meet. Showing me how to fork up and prepare the soil for the spring planting of vegetable and flower seeds in our large backyard garden. Taking me to watch my first hockey game at the old amphitheater in downtown Winnipeg between the Winnipeg Monarchs and the St. Barnabas Canadians. Sitting with me on cold October nights in Winnipeg Stadium for my annual birthday treat of seeing the Bombers beat the Regina Roughriders. Traveling with me on the Great Northern Railway to Minneapolis to watch 3 games between the White Sox and Twins in the year that Major League Baseball came to Minneapolis, St. Paul. And finally, taking me to a Royal Canadian Legion convention in the summer of 1964 to hear Prime Minister Pearson introduce to a distinctly hostile audience the maple leaf design for the new Canadian flag, and so showing me what one courageous government leader in our country could be. These are a boy's and young man's memories of his father. I will miss my dad, but I will never lose those memory glimpses of him when he was young. I want to thank my youngest sister, Frances, for her care and support of our father for the last years of his life. Thanks also to my brothers and sisters and their families in Winnipeg for their attention to our father that helped to keep his life active and interesting for so long. And thanks to all of you here this afternoon for remembering and honoring our father and his life. Well, George and Connie, other 4 children, are with us today, and their son Bruce will now deliver a tribute on their behalf. Bruce?
Good afternoon. It is my honor to share with you some stories of my dad, George Waters. Dad loved to tell a good story. He would always begin a story by saying, "You might have heard this story before, but..." And of course, none of his stories was complete without a coincidence. Oh yes, those coincidences. You might have heard this story before, but did I tell you about the time that Dad was driving a school trustee home from a local convention? When he got to the individual's house, Dad asked, "Is there a plaque in that house?" The passenger responded, "Well, why would there be a plaque in my house?" Dad replied, "Well, because that's where George Waters was born, 389 Toronto Street. What a coincidence." Dad's parents originated from Wick, Scotland. Dad was born in Winnipeg on what was called Dominion Day on July 1st, 1919. When Dad was only 6 weeks old, as you've heard earlier today, his father, John George Waters, drowned at Grand Beach. Sadly, this did not make life very easy for Dad, his mother, and his older sister, my Aunt Betty. After his father's death, his mother, Margaret Ann Miller, eked out a living as a waitress and found a way to feed and clothe 2 young children. As he got older, Dad took on part-time jobs to help support the family. Amongst other jobs, he used to deliver, by bicycle, photographs for Winnipeg Photo through winter and summer and all the other seasons. What a coincidence. I am an avid all-season cyclist, and I can appreciate the challenge of a Winnipeg winter. And when I'm pushing through those tall drifts and those strong winds, I often think of one of Dad's school poems that he penned. Ready for this? "Hello, hello, it's 40 below. I know, I froze my toe." Dad was quite a poet. Speaking of Dad's education, let me tell you about one of Dad's high school experiences at Daniel McIntyre Collegiate. Due to Dad's academic successes, many of Dad's teachers expected him to go on to university. But Dad knew that this was not to be. He had to continue to help his family and therefore needed to find a full-time job. One of his teachers, Mr. Forsyth, arranged for Dad to start work at Scott Bathgate Company down on Pioneer Street right next to the Nutty Club. As jobs were very scarce at that time, Dad would have to start his job before the final school exams. The school administrator, knowing of the family's financial situation, granted Dad special consideration, and the school exempted him from writing his grade 11 final exams. Many years later, Dad proudly received his official high school diploma from St. James Collegiate. It even came with a graduation cap that unfortunately was a tad too small. In 1941, Dad enlisted in the Royal Canadian Air Force. That's the Air Force, not the Air Farce. That's something different. Upon receiving administrative training in Trenton, Ontario, part of which included some submarine patrols in a Hudson aircraft over the Gulf of St. Lawrence, Dad was posted overseas at RAF and RCAF, Lancaster bomber stations at Minton-on-Ouse and Tulthorpe in the Yorkshire area of England. Coincidentally, Dad's wing commander was none other than Manitoba's own, the Right Honourable Duff Roblin. Yes, Dad learned from the best. You might have heard this story before, but did I tell you that Dad met his wife-to-be while he was over in England? Her name was Constance Paul. Mom was a Women's Auxiliary Air Force sergeant, and her key role, as she saw it, was to protect the English girls under her command from those Canadian brutes. She fell short on this count because George and Connie were married in Liverpool on December 12, 1944. After the war, they settled at 268 Sharp Boulevard in sunny St. James. It is in this home that they raised 6 children: John, Anne, Isabel, Bruce, Gordon, and Francis. The Waters clan inundated the school system in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. As children, we went on many jaunts and family vacations, whether it was to Traverse Bay near Victoria Beach at Owen Griffith's family cottage, or out to Sioux Narrows to Reverend Honeywell's guest cottage on an island out near Sioux Narrows. Dad did the driving, basically, and he was always asking us to look out for grasshoppers. We pointed out many along the way. Little did we know that grasshoppers were actually called cows. And at the end of any trip, we could always count on Dad to say the classic words: "Here we are for where we're going, never here for there, get out." In the decade after the war, Dad found himself gaining valuable work experiences in the insurance and food distribution businesses, as you've heard before, in Winnipeg and across Western Canada, actually. Dad would often bring home samples of candies that he was distributing. We kids were actually the beginnings of market testing strategies. And I fear that Dad was personally responsible for many of his children having a finely tuned sweet tooth. When you join us later in the reception area, you will note an array of Werther's Original Candies, Pink Friends biscuits, and Terry's chocolate oranges. This is no coincidence. Dad loved his sweets, and whenever anybody visited 268, he would always offer them a treat. Dad eventually secured his career job at Deer Lodge Hospital, just 2 blocks from his home on Sharp Boulevard, as the administrator of the personnel department. Dad flourished in this position and made many lifelong friends, both in this department and on the general staff at the hospital. With this new job, providing much more financial security and stability, Dad found time to give back to the community that had supported him and his mother and his sister in his younger years. He served on the local school board, as you've heard, made many donations to many charities, helped the Air Force Reserves, and became a member of many community organizations. Furthermore, it was no coincidence that every year Dad donated to the Salvation Army. They helped him. Sorry. Nothing like some waters. Wasn't it? They helped him in his time of need, so he would help others in their time of need. In his later years, Dad loved his contests. Reader's Digest sweepstakes, mail-in coupons for cereals. If there was a contest to enter, Dad was there. You might have heard this story before, but did I tell you about the time that Dad and Mom won, through a Peak Friends contest, a free trip to Europe on the luxury liner the QE2 to watch some musical theater in London, take in some guided tours, and then return to New York on the Concorde? The Scottish side of Dad thought that he was getting a great deal. Little did he know that he actually paid for this trip many times over with all the Peak Friends product that he had purchased over the years. And talk about a coincidence. Guess who got to go into the cockpit on that Concorde trip, flying at Mach 3 over the Atlantic, and was able to share his wartime stories with the pilots? Yes, it was Dad. Actually, it was no coincidence. Dad had his RCAF pin in his lapel and was wearing his RCAF tie. This was not lost on the crew members. They knew they had someone special on the flight. Dad was also a loyal supporter of the monarchy. I guess having a wife from across the pond might have had something to do with this. Dad loved every opportunity to meet royalty. You might have heard this story before, but did I tell you about the time that Princess Anne, on a visit to Winnipeg, saw this elderly gentleman with a row of war medals proudly displayed on his jacket? She came over to speak with him, and without missing a beat, Dad pulled out his pile of pocket props. In this assortment of memorabilia was an old photograph of the then Princess Elizabeth when she was visiting his bomber base in Telthorpe during the war. Dad shared this picture and the story behind it with the princess. After this brief conversation, a royal attaché came back and spoke with Dad. And Dad had a chance to peddle the Paths to Freedom book written by his friend Bob Kello. The Queen did eventually get her own personal copy of the book, and she sent a special letter back to Dad thanking him for the book, which she had read and had found fascinating. Dad actually got to personally meet the Queen twice on both of her visits to Winnipeg. He was even invited. I'm sure she was invited too, but he was even invited to the special reception at the Lieutenant Governor's house to meet with the Queen. Dad was very proud. He added this letter from the Queen to the magical pocket props pile. Speaking of the Paths to Freedom book, Dad was the penultimate salesman. Every time I visited him in the mall bookstores, he was on a mission to make the Paths to Freedom book the #1 bestseller in Winnipeg for that week. This happened many times. Let's face it, who could resist a sweet old man with a sales pitch? In fact, when I took my own young children to see their grandfather in action at the mall, Grandpa could not talk too long because he had books to sell, and he had already sold us a copy. I would be remiss if I did not mention the politics of Dad. As you might know, Dad was a staunch progressive conservative supporter for as long as I can remember. Any conservative candidate in his riding knew that they could count on George to display a conservative sign on his lawn. Now, in the most recent election, there was no sign on his front yard. This troubled him. The universe was not unfolding as it should. I asked Dad, why the change in strategy, Dad? His response? He was a little upset with the Conservative Party's stance on home mail delivery. You see, Dad loved checking his mailbox every day for correspondence. In his youth, Dad did not have a chance to further his education, but he certainly knew how important education truly was. Amongst Dad's proudest accomplishments were the educational programs that both he and my mother, Connie, initiated. Amongst others, the St. James Scholarship Foundation, providing scholarships through business contributions to deserving students. The Constance Waters Memorial Scholarship at the University of Winnipeg for students planning a career in the educational field. Work placement programs, some even done at Deer Lodge Hospital. The Laureate Academy, a private school with a focus on students with learning disabilities. It is no coincidence that many of Dad's children, their spouses, and even his grandchildren were and are involved in the field of education. Dad was extremely proud that the St. James Assiniboia School Division, of which he was a trustee for 18 years, recognized his educational contributions by naming a school in his honor. Whenever I drove Dad by the George Waters Middle School, he would always say, "Don't look now, but there's my middle." You might have heard these stories before about George Waters, but rest assured, his story is not complete by any means. Dad's story continues with his children, his children's children, and his children's children's children. Thank you.
like to share with you a short picture montage of Grandpa George's life. By gum, his journey had its ups and downs, but through all 96 1/3 years, everything worked out just fine. So please join us, and we hope you enjoy this little tribute to George.
Thank you, Lindsay, for that wonderful collage. If I'm right, there's going to be a longer version in the reception room afterwards. Good. And thank you, Bruce, for all the stories. You know, some of us heard at least some of them sometime before. But it's always good to hear them again, and I hope this will not be the last time. We will now have a minute of silence in which we reflect on George's life, on our own personal memories and Washington for each of us. Friends and family, that concludes our service in honor of George Waters. On behalf of his family, I thank you all for coming. Invite all of you to follow them to the reception room where we can continue to share our memories and stories about George.